So we just taught the lesson regarding prepositional phrases to show location. And I have Steve and Susie with me, and we're going to talk a little bit about the lesson itself. And I'll have Steve and Susie jump in because we were talking with the classroom teachers whose kids we had. There were 3 of them in that room. And we talked a little bit about the strategy of getting kids into those lines of communication. And you notice that the kids were a little reticent. And that's because it's the first time they've done it. And I did comment to the team that truly those students were level 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. So in the new LPAC scale, they probably would be high 2s, maybe a low 3 in that new 4-point scale. And they were what I will call true 3s. I could hear as I was assessing, and I pointed out in the video, I could hear that they were still struggling with in and on and using but confusing those. Around seemed a little bit easier. I also jotted down for myself that idea that a single subject needs a predicate, a verb with an S on it, so the principal walks. I want to revisit that tomorrow if I'm working with that group. I wanted to point out as well that you see that I didn't have them read a lot. I just kind of let it flow, read a couple, had them read. And the reason for that is I'm not doing a small group for reading. I am using that time, that 30 minutes of the designated ELD that we do every day, I'm using that time to show kids how language works, which I talked about earlier. And so you'll notice I didn't say prepositional phrase, even though that's written in the book, and even in the student edition. I didn't use the term prepositional phrase because what I want to show them is what they're doing, and that's called the function. I wanted to show them we're talking about location. And when we talk about location, these are the ways we can talk about location: in, on, around, through. We used those simple ones that the text introduced, but I can definitely add to that list later on. I also want to talk about assessment. As I heard the kids in the line of communication, as a classroom teacher, I'd be noting the fact that about 4 of them really struggled with making it a complete sentence. And part of that was cognitive load. They're trying to think of the answer and then frame the answer into a sentence. So I may just give them more of a frame, if you will, for their responses. I always want them to do the thinking and then give them the frame, instead of giving them the frame and then having them do the thinking, because that can be confusing for them. The other thing that I want to point out, if you're going to use lines of communication, and really you can use that with every kid in your classroom. You could have 32 kids and 16 partners. When you're doing those lines of communication, you could hear that the kids got more confident with it, not just with the strategy, but with the language itself, because you have more to say when you've talked to a partner. So if you were doing that in integrated ELD later in the day, or even just using it for your whole class, then you might ask, what are 4 characteristics of amphibians? You're studying that in science, and they could ask the question, and they could just answer 1 characteristic and then go to the next one and make it 2 and 3 and 4. So that's just a great interactive strategy. I called it Tea Party in my classroom. I used it so much that the kids were, every time I'd say Tea Party, oh, okay, we're going to have another tea party. But however we organize that, however we situate it, we want to make sure that kids are up and moving and speaking to one another. So I didn't use reading except as a tool, just to remind them of the content that they had covered. And I had them do a little bit of writing. I really wanted to focus on some writing there. When I saw the level of language, we moved away from more writing, and I did more speaking because they were a little lower than I had thought in language. And then I want to make sure at the end of every ELD lesson that I've asked the question, did I do listening, speaking, and writing? And did I use reading as a tool? I don't always have to use reading as a tool. But the 3 non-negotiables I have for that 30 minutes, listening, speaking, reading, writing, did my kids do all 3 of those things? And did they interact? Structure and interaction. The teachers asked a couple of questions. I'm trying to remember what those were. I'll ask Susie and Steve to help me remember what those were.
We talked about the difference between grammar and ELD lessons.
Yeah, so we talked about the difference between grammar and syntax, and again, it's the difference between saying you're going to learn prepositions and you're going to learn how to talk about location.
Right.
So it's always a danger because we have been trained as grammarians to teach a grammar lesson rather than a syntax lesson. The other thing that we talked about with the teachers is they talked about they have the kids in A and B partners, but they can't get them to talk in A and B partners. And you could tell at the table they were a little shy about talking, but as soon as they got into lines of communication, it's so face forward that they couldn't avoid the conversation and we couldn't just kind of skip over it. So that's the lesson. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. If you have feedback or questions that you have that are specific, you can direct those to the curriculum department, and we're excited to have that conversation with you about designated ELD.